And talking about crazy and Auckland University, I had the misfortune yesterday to watch Jack Tame again. And I don't know what it is about TVNZ's current affairs, but you know my view on the state broadcaster and the fact that they have an agenda that is clearly designed to oppose the government, that it's almost pathological. You know, Television New Zealand News, Radio New Zealand News. And so Jack Tame just added another, well, what is it, sort of mini chapter or paragraph to that particular script that is lovingly curated, I have to say, by the news editors of our state broadcasters. On Sunday, he had a teacher, an award-winning educator, who, and God knows why, I'll come to him in a second, the guest in a second, but he was invited on to actually critique essentially the way in which kids learn in New Zealand, and essentially to criticise the reformative regime or reforms that are being promoted by the current Education Minister, Erica Stanford, and by this centre-right government. Now, I think most New Zealanders accept, and certainly we've had on the show over the last wee while, an understanding that our education system is in crisis, and it's failed. And it hasn't failed because of COVID. I mean, that is the great lie. If anybody ever says to you, or any educator or teacher or principal or media commentator says, oh, well, the reason the education system is failing is because of COVID, just smack them, will you? And then listen, and I'll give you permission, just quietly, because they need to be brought into reality. It's in addition to which they have blatantly lied in front of you, and it's not acceptable to suggest that systemic failure for year after year after year by so-called educators, and particularly by policymakers and by ministers of education, plural, and by Parliament, it's not fair to exonerate them and say, oh, well, it's not our fault, it's COVID's. No, I'm afraid it's not COVID's. New Zealand's education system was failing before COVID came along, and although COVID may have added the exclamation mark at the end, it was already bad. It failed everywhere. It failed to teach kids how to read, write, and do basic mathematics. It failed internationally against a whole series of standards that might be applied from the OECD to any other international standard that might be out there, like the PISA tests. It failed to provide kids with a proper assessment regime so that any parent or employer knew what could or couldn't do, and it failed most clearly to provide a pathway to those kids to become the best that they could be, because it didn't give them the basics, didn't give them any idea, and gave them a worldview that somehow competition wasn't required anyhow when they were going into a competitive world and competing against literally hundreds of thousands of other kids who had grades and educational standards much better than their own. Add millions, add billions if you want to actually add the rest of the world. All right, so what does Television New Zealand and Jack Tame do on Sunday? Well, they go and find somebody. They didn't find a teacher. They didn't, to be fair, they didn't go find a trade union education rep. They didn't even go and, they certainly didn't find anybody at the Ministry of Education. I mean, those people are the problem. They went and found an award-winning educator. That's how they described him, who's written a book. Wow. Who argues that policymakers, and that's, well, frankly, politicians including, and especially Erica Stanford, have got it all wrong. They are reaching for simplistic solutions creating educational anxiety over how students are doing at numeracy and literacy tests. And instead, this award-winning educator, I'll come to him in just a second, used this entire interview to say, we're assessing kids wrong, that's the reason they're failing, and we've got to get rid of streaming. And what was the other thing he said? We've got to get rid of streaming, and we've got to get rid of the idea that you should be testing kids basically at all, because all you're doing is labeling them as failures. I mean, it's classic dissembling. But the person that they got, as I said, is no real expert. He comes from England. He's come to New Zealand. Yeah. He's an academic at Auckland University. Oh, well, is he in the education department? No. No, his name is Professor Welby Ings, I-N-G-S, British, European British. of extraction, I think. And he is, in actual fact, he's been involved in arts research. Educational research. No. He's taught. No. No. Not in a school. Not in any school in New Zealand. He is a professor of art and design at Auckland University of Technology, which isn't really a university, it's a glorified polytechnic. This is the person that they brought on Television New Zealand to critique and criticise the assessment regime and the reforms that are currently being applied by Erica Stanford and by this current government. Couldn't even go and find a teacher or go and find somebody who actually has nothing to do with the classroom. He does lecture, to be fair, at Auckland University of Technology, and he is involved as a creative. So he's apparently a filmmaker and all those sorts of things. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. He's a member of the Designers Institute of New Zealand. He's on the New Zealand Screen Directors Guild, for God's sake, but he sure isn't anybody who knows anything about compulsory education in this country from the ages of 5 to 18. Not a dicky bird. But the really interesting thing about Professor Ings and people like them is that essentially they are arguing if kids are failing, it isn't the fault of kids. It isn't the fault of their parents. It isn't the fault of their educators, the people who are teaching them. It is the failure of the system because the system is set up to assess them and test them as to what they know and what they don't. So if you are going to use that kind of assessment regime, if you are going to grade them on their ability, whatever it might be, that is inherently wrong. It will fail, and as a consequence of failing, said child will go out into the world with a very poor and dim record of themselves. It's an argument that essentially would be beloved, I have to say, of the teacher unions, which is we don't want anybody to fail. We don't want to tell anybody that they're not achieving. We don't want to tell anybody that they need to pull their socks up. We don't want to tell anybody that they haven't got the basic building blocks of education right yet, and until they do, they won't be able to go on and do the rest of them. Professor Ings actually describes himself, and this is hilarious. This is a self-description. Professor Ings actually describes himself as a disobedient thinker. What sort of wanker would describe themselves as a disobedient thinker? But that's the first way he describes himself, as a disobedient thinker, on his bio at the Auckland University of Technology. Can I just say, so you've just brought that person with that sense of almost nihilistic purpose onto our education and into our television screens on a Sunday morning to critique the government's education policy when they've already decided that they are that kind of tosser. And goes on, and he also goes on to say that he questions our anxious micromanagement of thought and our preoccupation with tick-spot assessment. And he is apparently on the board of Creative New Zealand, and his research covers the historical, wait for this, metamorphosis of underground languages, methodological approaches to creative practice in higher research education, and the reconceptualization of doctoral research. These are the people that Television New Zealand tell us are exes. This is the person that Jack Tame wants to come on and give a critique of what it's really like in the classroom and for our kids to be learning every day. This is the agenda of Television New Zealand, riding out again on a Sunday morning. They may as well just gone and got Bruce Mahalski and been done with it. All right, those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?